Okay, so this week we plan on talking about early decision and what does that mean. Um, if you've been here before, you know that the chat feature is disabled, but you are free to ask any questions you can in the Q&A box. I monitor them as the webinar goes on, so feel free to put anything in there, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. So the first, and then if we have time at the very end, we'll just quickly talk about the new FAFSA that the government just put out the other day, that it should be available starting December 31st. So if there's any questions about that. But in January 4th, we're going to continue that conversation regarding the new FAFSA because hopefully by then it'll be out and there will be more information available. If there's any questions to start, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I'm going to begin. So it is early decision time. Some students have begun to find out from their early decision schools. Others are still waiting. But what does all of it mean? So early decision is if your student applied early decision, that means it is a binding choice. Binding meaning that if they were to be admitted to the college or the university, they have to attend. So let's go through the process first. If a student were admitted early decision, so if a student found out they were admitted early decision within the next couple of weeks or so, their letter and their notification from the university or college will have a deadline by when they need to matriculate by. Remember, this is binding, so students need to matriculate by that time. Along with that comes if the student had applications in anywhere else, not early decision applications, but applications in anywhere else, they are to withdraw all those other applications. And sometimes they can do it on the portal. Sometimes they can contact the admissions office of those schools, but they are not to get decisions from those other schools. They are to withdraw their applications. With the matriculation process comes a deposit. Every school varies in the deposit they want. So just make sure that you're looking in that notification of when that date is that the student needs to matriculate by and what that deposit looks like. From there, the school will walk your student through what orientation looks like, what registering for classes looks like, if they're living on that campus, what the process is for housing, and then they kind of go by what notifications they get from the school. But like I said in my previous emails, it is really, really important for the student to continue to look at notifications from the school so they don't miss anything. So so that really kind of sums up, I mean, it's pretty straightforward when they get accepted to early decision because it is binding, so they do have to go. Is there any questions regarding acceptance to early decision? Okay, so if there are, you can definitely, put them in the Q&A box and I will see them. But let's talk about what happens when a student gets deferred from early decision. So when a student gets deferred from early decision, it means that they are put in the regular decision pool. So students are then looked over for the school again in the regular decision pool with the regular decision students who had submitted that way. What it means as far as, so then it is no longer binding. So once a student is put into the regular decision pool, the admit is no longer binding. So say the student gets in on a regular decision, they still have the option to go anywhere else. What that also means is if a student gets deferred from early decision 1, if there are early decision 2 applications that the student would like to submit, they are now able to at this time. So, so students are able to submit those applications. And just like early decision 1, early decision 2 is binding. So if they get into that early decision 2 school, they will matriculate there. The other thing is with deferrals is if a student did not apply, I mean, we recommend that they apply to other schools just as backups, but if a student for some reason did not apply to other schools, because they only applied to the early decision school, this is also now the time to start their other applications as well. So they have different options in the regular decision pool to attend to. Are there any questions, thoughts about early decision deferrals? Something also that is, and I don't know if anyone on this call, their student applied what we're calling REA, so restrictive early action. It's fairly new to the higher ed landscape, but it's in private schools. So one of the more famous schools that use it is Yale. So if a student applied, restrictive early action, it's non-binding, but they could not apply to any other early action or early decision programs in the private institution. They could apply to an early action program at a public institution, a non-binding early action program at a public institution. But same thing applies. Once that decision is given for restrictive early action, the student is free to then, if they want to apply to an early decision 2 school, whether public or private, once that decision is made, then they're free to kind of apply where they want. So that's kind of new, and not many schools are using restrictive early action. There's a question in the box: if there's deferral or rejection, do they have enough time to do the ED2? So if they get deferred from early decision 1, there is enough time. So on the college landscape, a lot of them have spaced it out appropriately. So that way there's enough time to submit ED2. If there is a thought, what I would recommend is if there is a thought about an ED2, if that's something that the student is interested in, if they do get a deferral, they can look and kind of prepare if there's like supplements or something that they need to do for that ED2 school, and they can prepare that. That way they're ready to go once they have the notification. And I mean, hopefully it's favorable, hopefully they get in, but if they do get deferred, they are ready to go to just submit. But most of the deadlines do coincide so that they have enough time to apply to an ED2. Does that answer your question? Okay. So there was a lot of information just swirling around about ED1, ED2, early action. Also, I'm just going to touch on early action. I know this isn't really about early action, but we're just going to refresh for those who may not know. Early action is a tool also used by colleges and universities where the student can apply early, but what that means is that it is a non-binding decision. So a student can get in earlier, but they don't necessarily have to matriculate. And if a student gets in on early action, they don't have to make a decision right away. As where early decision, if they get in early decision 1, they have a time frame where they have to matriculate and send that deposit into that school. Okay. Are there any questions surrounding ED1, ED2, acceptances, deferrals, any of that? If you think of something, you can absolutely still ask in the question box, and I will be, again, monitoring it. So that's like really ED1, ED2 and restrictive early action summarized. Okay, so moving on to the new FAFSA. So for those of you who don't know, the federal government did say that it will be released on December 31st. So Happy New Year. It'll be released December 31st because they did promise December. So we're waiting to hear more information of what that release is going to look like. For those of you who don't know what FAFSA stands for, it is the free application for federal student aid. So a lot of universities will have you fill it out if you're interested in getting any types of financial aid. So with the new FAFSA, the meetings that we have been on thus far, they're supposedly making it more simple. So we have not actually seen it yet, but they're condensing the questions is what it sounds like to us. We're actually all attending a webinar later today to get more information about it. But they will be releasing it in real time, hopefully on December 31st. So there's really nothing that you can do now. There's very little information out about it. The one thing you can do, and they recommend just to, keep your username and password somewhere safe, is you can create an FSA ID. So one of the things that was told to us is the parent and the student will need an FSA ID. And you can go on and do that right now. One of the benefits to that is the processing time for FSA ID can take up to 2 weeks. So if you do it now, theoretically, you should have an FSA ID by the beginning of January when FAFSA is released, and then you can begin to work on it. So without an FSA ID, it is told to us that you cannot begin to work on FAFSA. So that is one thing that you can do to prepare. Otherwise, there is little information out there about it, but we're learning more and more every day, and we are hoping that when it's released, we'll have a better grasp on what they're asking. But just know, they're saying that it should be more simple. So, and if there's, situations where you have questions, you can follow up with your counselor or your student's counselor to ask those questions. So January 4th, there'll be another webinar also, and we're going to dive a little bit more into FAFSA once, and hopefully by January 4th, it is released. Once it's released, we're going to dive into a little bit more of what that process looks like and what it looks like to fill out FAFSA with your student, if that's something you're interested in. So are there any questions surrounding FAFSA? So the FAFSA ID, the FSA ID, so if you literally Google FSA ID, it'll come up to create an account for federal student aid. And you'll be able to kind of go into there, answer all the questions that you need, create username and password, and they'll be able to start creating that for you. Does that make sense? It's like the first thing that comes up when you Google it. But they did say in a meeting that I was in a couple of weeks ago that it could take up to 2 weeks to process. So that's why we're telling all students and parents to do that. If they can do that now, then at least they'll have that process done by the time the FAFSA is released. Because FAFSA, as most of you know, and if you don't know, FAFSA is usually released in October. So this is definitely later, than in the past. And once you fill out a FAFSA, the college or the university that the student is accepted to still has to package the student, which means get their financial aid package together. So everything is a little bit pushed out this year. So that's one way you can kind of get ahead by creating that FSA ID. Okay. So the conversation. Okay, so one of the questions, so there's another question in the chat, how can we accept ED if we don't know about financial aid? So in the ED agreement, the ED agreement is that the student will accept their ED decision. So if it's an acceptance, they'll accept it regardless of financial aid. So while financial aid was pushed out a little bit this year, it does say in the agreement that some schools, even if the FAFSA was early on, some schools still wouldn't know by ED. So it is in that agreement that they will accept the admission, whether they know about financial aid or not, that they're willing to pay. Does that answer your question about ED and financial aid? The student, so just to clarify, the student will still get their financial aid package, but it may be after they matriculate into the school. So you may not know until after they matriculate what they're getting as far as financial aid. Yeah, it's a little bit, that's what a little bit of a risk is with ED, not knowing exactly what the financial aid looks like beforehand, before you matriculate into the school. And same thing with ED2, while ED2 is a little bit later, so you may or may not know financial aid, but it's the same thing. If you don't have your financial aid package by the time you get an ED2 decision, that all the rules are the same. So the student would still matriculate without knowing financial aid. That is like the one difference between early action and early decision. So early action, if a student were to apply early action, it's non-binding. So the student would find out earlier if they were accepted to the university, but they wouldn't have to make a decision. So they could potentially wait for that financial aid package, or if they're applying to scholarships or other things. Okay. Are there any other questions regarding ED1, ED2, FAFSA, FSAID? So for those of you who missed, I just want to, someone asked about how to create the FSAID. Literally, if you Google create FSAID, it's the first thing that comes up, create an account with federal student aid. And like I said before, that's something that you could do now, even though the FAFSA is not released yet. That's something you can do now. So you can log into the FAFSA when it is released. And the FSAID, again, could take up to 2 weeks to process. So you and your student needs one. We kind of cover, we did cover everything that I had planned today for ED1, ED2. Someone asked that parents for the FSAID. So right now, that's one of the things that is a little unclear to us right now at this point in the FAFSA process. They have something, and if it's still the same, because they've been changing the iterations as they've been giving us information too, but they have something called a parent wizard to figure out who the contributor is. Because in some instances, it does not need to be both parents. So that's something that I think is going to kind of roll out as the FAFSA rolls out, to understand whether it's both parents or one parent. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that, because I don't think FAFSA has an answer for that yet. That's something that's kind of to be determined. But they do have something called a parent wizard that's supposed to figure out who the contributor is and who that parent is. So if that's a question that you're not really sure which parent, your student could create their FSAID and at least begin working on it. And then there might be more information once FAFSA comes out. Another question is, when should we get early action responses? And is it true they defer to regular decision now? So if you can clarify the second part of that question, I will I will answer that. But the first part is, when should we get early action responses? So early action responses are coming in as well, around this time. So they're coming in around the same time as early decision. So a lot of times a school will have a release date for their early action. So many times if you go on that school's website, it'll say, early action deadline by November 15th, November 1, release decision by, and it'll give a time when they're releasing their decision. Some of the early actions roll out their decisions as they get them. Some of them have a release date. So if you don't know what the response date is, you can always call the admissions office and they will tell you when it is. But they're around this time also. Some are January, but a lot are around this time too. And then if you want to clarify, is it true they defer to regular decision? I don't know, if you want to clarify that second part, I can definitely answer that second part. Okay. Okay, so we hear colleges are now deferring most early actions to regular admissions. So that's something that I will say really depends on the school. There are a lot of schools that are deferring their early action and early decision to regular decision, because there's a lot that apply early action, early decision. So really it depends on the university or the college. So that's something that you can ask the admissions office. A lot of times they'll have numbers, like a percentage that they take from the early decision or early action pool. But yeah, in recent years, I mean, that is correct. In recent years, we've heard of a lot of deferrals out of the early decision, early action pools. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the student does not get in. That just means they are reviewed for a second time as part of the regular admissions process. Did that answer your question? How does SUNY usually handle early action? Are you referring to SUNY? I'll wait for a response. How does SUNY usually handle early action? I mean, again, SUNY has 64 campuses, so it is really dependent on each individual campus. Again, SUNY, when you look at SUNY as a whole, you can't really look at SUNY as a whole because each individual campus is so different. So if you do have a question about what does their early action process look like and how many students get in off of early action, I would call that individual campus and ask them. Some campuses also only rolled out early action, like Stony Brook for the first time this year. So I think there's also some campuses may not have that information either if they're rolling it out for the first time this year. I hope that answered that question. And then the other question is, if a student doesn't apply for early decision 1, can they apply for early decision 2? Yes. So if a student was not ready to apply for early decision 1, and they weren't sure where they wanted to apply or where they wanted to commit to, but now all of a sudden they have a very clear vision that they want to go to this school no matter what, and the school offers early decision 2, they can absolutely apply early decision 2. Just remember, all of those rules apply. It is binding, and it is, they will matriculate there if they do get in. All right. Awesome. Those were some really, really, really good questions. So that really sums up today's webinar. I'll hang around for a couple more moments if someone else has another question, but I hope to see you all on January 4th when we return from holiday break to kind of talk about that stuff. So thank you for joining me today, and thank you for sticking with us through the technical difficulties. I appreciate it. Have a good day, everyone.